So my name is Sander Berkouwer. I live in, it was close, right? Yep. I live in the Netherlands and I actually have a slide on that, but I won't bore you with my boring details. But I work as a consultant in the Netherlands, consulting mainly on identity and access management and just having fun. I see a couple of people leaving the room. Here's a piece of advice. If you're managing a multi-domain or a multi-forest environment, currently in Active Directory, you may want to go to the other session. And I'm saying this deliberately, not to scare you away, but because Microsoft currently has a strategy where if you want this stuff to work, you should actually go to a one domain, one forest approach with one, I think we call it Entra Connect now, server, and one Entra ID tenant. Because that is the infrastructure that Microsoft is now focusing all its resources on. If you're on that path, I think you're a very lucky person because you can really get all that goodness from Entra ID into your Active Directory without a lot of hassle. And when I talk about hassle, I'm talking about P's. I'm talking about people, processes, political stuff, all the things that you, as I'm guessing as I look at this room, you guys don't want to, you don't guys want to find at your workplace when you just want to manage your Active Directory right. So if you're on that one AD, one Entra ID path, I think that today already, and I talked to Joe Kaplan about it, and he said, well, no way. But I think today already, you can do some amazing stuff from the Entra portal, from the Graph API, towards your Active Directory. And I'll start easy, and then we go deeper and deeper into some fantastic stuff that you could use today. Now, the reason why Joe can't use it today is because Joe is hitting the 5 million object sync limit in Entra Connect. Most organizations aren't that large. And I think even if you look at the typical organization that Microsoft works with, that Microsoft Office Entra ID to, and remember there's about 40 million tenants, right, worldwide in Entra ID. They're not all millions of objects. And you can ease into that as a consultant. You can start with your smaller clients. You can grow into, well, doing the things that Joe does. And as you do, the one thing that will really help you throughout your career, I think, is making the right choices. If you know what the strategy is from Microsoft, if you know what the nice things to have, the things you should have, the things you could have, if you focus on that, and every step you set is in that direction, and it's a good step. It's not just effective, but also efficient. And as you notice, I'm getting a bit philosophical at times. At other times, I'm being very specific with a 5 million limit, for instance. And this session is going to have a bit of both. But the main objective for me when I wrote this session, and I'm going to reference Joe again because Joe actually entered a session to the HIP program saying how to get rid of Active Directory. Obviously, for a hybrid identity protection conference, that wouldn't make it to the agenda, but this did. And yesterday, the question was asked if someone or if anyone in the room sees Active Directory being decommissioned within their organization within 2 years. We only saw one hand. When the question was turned around and said, do you guys see Active Directory be in your company indefinitely at this moment? Almost everyone raised their hand because that's what we're seeing. But it doesn't mean that Active Directory is going to remain as strategic or as pivotal, as you will, for identity and access management in your organization. I think, and Guido and I just talked about that, about application modernization being the key to decommissioning Active Directory. Sure, yeah, Well, we can't do that. Or we need P's again. People, processes, political decision, and all that stuff. Ah, no. So what we're seeing is Active Directory staying around. Doesn't mean that we have to provision into Active Directory first and then syncing up to Active Directory. So, there we go, Entra ID. Thanks, Guido. It could just mean that even in the time frame that Microsoft is currently communicating, that 10-year time frame, that what we're seeing is that Active Directory is just going to be that really cute, hopefully more mature attribute store for the legacy applications that we have to keep around, that we keep around. But it's a different role in an organization. It's not a leading role. It's just an attribute store that follows, like we're doing with Entra ID at the moment. In most organizations, Active Directory is main. And as an industry, we've had some really bad words. But I think main or leading and following are the right words here. So where Entra ID is following right now, we can already make decisions to make our lives easier as AD admins by making Entra ID leading. Boring slides. So this is what I'm talking about. When we're managing Active Directory currently, what we're using, and with Active Directory actually we can, right? We're using the remote server administration tools. Well, except for ADFS, because they only have administration tool, they're not remote. And except for ADCS, where, well, that's an entirely different story again. So we also do things like RDP and RDP into stuff, and we do privileged access workstations. But it's a mess. And it's based on Kerberos, it's based on DNS, it's all the things that are, sure, the shoulders of giants, but also not that reliably. While instead, and that's something that I want to pitch to you today, is we can use any device, just use HTTPS, and if we have to RDP, let me be real clear about this. Microsoft has a different documentation on this. RDP is the ransomware deployment protocol. So we don't do that. But we can have a bastion host to connect to our domain controllers that I think inevitably will also just run as Azure VMs. So we can do that. We can manage everything with HTTPS, and if we're smart, we won't use SSL v1, thank you, Eric. We will use TLS 1.2 or TLS 1.3 to do so that it's not just surrounded by something called encryption, but actually encrypted. And then through Entra ID Connect, or Connect Sync, or even Cloud Sync, because Microsoft is focusing resources now on Cloud Sync, we can manage our, and I'm just going to say it, our fragile domain controllers. Even if we manage them right, even if we install cumulative updates on the domain controllers, they break. If we don't install them, they get popped. That's a bit of a conundrum, if you will. So I think through Entra ID and through Entra ID Connect Sync and Connect Health in the mix too, and I'm going to share some other things with you, we can manage our fragile domain controllers better. For some of you who aren't as visually engaged, I also made a list where I say, you know what, these are the main differences as I see them. So we have RSAT, we have the Graph API on the other side. But there's also some real things missing on the left. The way we try to do it in the past is by air gapping. Wow. That's not just 1984 as a philosophy, but also as a year of actually doing that, I think. And also it's flawed because even air-gapped domain controllers need to be updated. How do you update them? Well, you get data to them. It's no longer fully air-gapped. Yeah, we have to extract data, or we have to import data. How do you do it? Well, with a USB stick. It's all those flaws. It's the same flaws over and over again. We don't have dynamic groups. We don't have machine learning. We don't have AI. We don't have identity protection. We have all the stuff that is, well, basically just static. When I learned Active Directory back in the day, we were taught that there's only 3 A's to identity and access management. Right? Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Nowadays, well, not anymore, but in the Windows Server 2016 days, if you learn about Active Directory, you would learn it as a 4th A as well, administration. It means if you have inactive accounts, inactive groups, you actually delete them. Like mind-blowing to older Active Directory admins. We actually delete stuff? Yeah, we actually do. Yep. Those 5 million objects that Joe is managing, 1 million is just inactive devices. But he can't throw it away because of P's. But we can just have all the goodness on the right side and just have fun with it. And the first thing we can do pretty easily is require strong authentication. Because as Eric just presented on, passwords suck. There's all kinds of other biblical things that I can say about passwords, but I won't because we only have a half an hour. But they cost money and they suck. So there's a couple of things that we can do, and there's things on here that it's funny, right? Because Troy Hunt only announced this 2 weeks ago, but it's already on the slides. Together with Azure AD, also 2 weeks ago, in terms of rename. And what I want to talk about today, at least, is these 3 things. So multi-factor authentication everywhere, where we can, implement Entra ID protection, and ban bad passwords. And David, you don't have to do it right now. All right. So let's talk about Azure multi-factor authentication. At least that's what I think it is called these days. It was never called Azure AD MFA, so I think it's still Azure MFA, not Entra, Azure MFA. So if we have a colleague and we have an Entra ID tenant, then the only thing we need to do is make sure that that colleague, and this for some organizations is hard enough, is to get that colleague to perform that one-time MFA registration. And yes, we would really want him to do the same thing 180 days afterwards, and then just to keep it real. But we need at least that first registration, because when we have it, any Entra ID integrated application that we can have MFA on, based on that one MFA registration. And it's not just those simple Entra ID integrated applications. It's not just those federated applications that Microsoft, on average, adds 30 off every month to Entra ID. No, if I have a federated application and I still have ADFS, I know people still do, then I can do the same thing with the Azure MFA adapter for ADFS and use that same MFA registration. Even if I have MFA server, I can actually get those MFA registrations up to Entra ID and use them there as well. If I have a legacy application with Radius, just works because I have an MFA extension for NPS. And hold on, these are 3 phases, right? Let me add the 4th for you as well. Because what we also can do is do any on-premises web application with the Entra ID app proxy. The thing that it has in common is that these are all web applications. So what do we do with non-web applications? Well, Microsoft has an answer for that as well these days with Entra Private Access. But we had to provide sessions about a half a year ago, so we didn't even know that was coming. So it isn't on the slides, it isn't in the session. So we can use that one MFA registration to protect all these applications. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, by the way. I've talked to many organizations and they've asked me, so we have Wi-Fi or we have some other thing that is purely on-prem. Should we use Azure MFA to protect it? So probably not, because if your internet connection is gone, you won't be able to do MFA. Well, luckily, if your internet connection is gone, people no longer come to the office, so you won't have that problem. But it is something to reconsider. Do we really, or can we really protect everything with Azure MFA or another internet-connected MFA method to protect purely on-prem stuff? Then there's Entra ID protection, and the fun thing is, and I don't know why, but even Alex didn't say this out loud, Entra ID protection is on by default for everything that is Microsoft Cloud. So whether you're using Azure AD accounts or Entra ID accounts, because where did Guido go? Oh, there's Guido. All the old guys are still saying Azure AD, right? So, okay. But if you're using a Microsoft account, it doesn't matter because it is all protected with those 123 checks from Entra ID protection. So we can just use it. If you want to manage it, if you want to make sure that a higher user risk or a higher sign-in risk actually does something in conditional access, that's when you need a P2 license. If you want to have the sign-in risk policy or user risk policy, or you want the MFA registration policy to be different than the default, then you need a P2 license. All the other things, just go with it. It's included. And then we have Entra ID password protection, which is a premium feature. So you need Entra ID premium licenses for this. And we can actually add banned words so that people who change their password or reset their password can no longer use these words in their passwords. So they become less guessable. Unfortunately, even if you don't provide any banned password parts, if you just deploy the components of this solution, it will actively block the top 1,000 of leaked passwords by default. So what happens is if a colleague, if we install the DC agent on our domain controllers, and this is important, right? Because a user can change their password on any domain controller, so the agent should be on any domain controller where a user can actually change or reset the password. And then if we implement the password protection proxy, which we do by default on every Azure AD Connect box, and then register it to look at the right Entra ID tenant, it will already import those top 1,000 leaked passwords. Then we can define the bad passwords, but that's optional. And we can define about 1,000 bad password parts when they're at least 4 characters long. I want to share something with you about the Dutch language, because we actually had fun with this while Microsoft was developing this solution. And I was at a university, and we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we would block all swear words from passwords? It appears the Dutch language is very efficient, and most swear words aren't even 4 characters long. What we also learned was, while we did the same experiment, or proposed the same experiment at a financial organization, they said, well, you'd rather not do that, please, because the password field is actually the only field where people can swear, and it might be some sort of stress relief to them. That made me think. So now every time a colleague changes the password, they go through the password filter on the domain controller where the protection DC agent plugs in, so they can't use the bad passwords and they can't use the top 1,000 leaked passwords. When an admin or service desk person resets the password, the same thing. When we use Entra ID self-service password reset, the same thing. As long as you have the DC agent on every domain controller and you have at least one password protection proxy component configured, this stuff just works. Now let's talk about managing access, because when you've got people that use strong authentication, the only thing left to do is more effectively manage access. The way we manage access in Active Directory is through groups. My word, have we gotten effective with nesting groups? And aren't we frustrated with the inability for some Entra and Azure components not to support nesting? Jeez, I know. But what we can do is, especially with the group writeback version 2, we can have any group that we define in Entra ID get written back to Active Directory and use it there. So what you'd effectively do is use the Entra portal to define your groups. Now, you know what? Let me tell you differently. So you can use the Graph API to create dynamic groups based on attributes if you have some attribute integrity in your Entra ID tenant. So if you know that department fields are filled in perfectly for all your users, now it's become really easy to create those department groups and provide access, because we can just do it with a dynamic group in Entra ID. There are some limitations to group writeback, though, because with version 2, we can actually make every group a back-writable group, I think. Is that it? Write-backable group? All right. We can do it for distribution groups, security groups, and mail-enabled security groups. Do we really need distribution groups for managing access? We don't, right? Okay, so that's not a limitation. But we can only write back as universal groups. If you're in a multi-forest environment, you would know that only domain local groups offer the functionality that you need across a forest boundary. So yes, that is a limitation. And that's why I said, if you're multi-forest, watch out. And you can use both user objects and computer objects as members. Now, there's not a lot of organizations that provide access based on computer objects, but if you need to, you can. And that means that we're gonna turn the table, actually. We're no longer, in the left, creating groups in Active Directory and syncing them up to Entra ID. No, we're authoring them in Entra ID and then write them back. And then just from the people picker on the file server, just pick the group and say, you know what? This group now has read-write access on this file share, for instance. Just like that. Well, just like that, I wish I only had to manage access to file servers. But unfortunately, I also have SQL servers, and I might already have on-prem SCIM-capable apps and services. And this is this functionality that Microsoft added a month ago. I think Alex Simons tweeted about this today even, because I think Microsoft doesn't see a lot of adoption for this, but it is really awesome. From Entra ID, I can provision a record in SQL Server as a profile for someone to specify their role in an app that uses that SQL Server as its backhand. Straight from Entra ID. Not from Active Directory, but straight from Entra ID. Cool stuff. And access, and this is something that most people forget, access is not just about provisioning and providing access, right? It's the fourth A. It's about removing access as well. So if I have groups that are authored in Entra ID, I can now, if I have the proper license, and this is a bit of a challenge right now because Microsoft is probably going to announce the cost, at least, for a add-on governance license on top of E5, which is now the rumor. But I can use access reviews, and I can use self-service group management, and I can use access packages to actually remove access, have application owners decide on whether someone remains in a group and have access. When we talk about availability, there's Azure AD Connect Health or Entra Connect Health now. That will tell you about the FSMA roles in Active Directory, for instance. There's Defender for Identity, which is something that we can talk about for another hour if we need to. There's another 2 hours in Microsoft Sentinel, of course. But I don't have to tell you the power of KQL queries and things like that. So that's all good fun. But it is there because we have Entra ID and we can integrate all that stuff. There's cloud machine learning that you can use with Microsoft Sentinel and with with Defender for Identity to make our fragile domain controllers managed better. So wrapping this up, the picture that I showed you at the beginning was about managing Active Directory through HTTPS, through Entra ID, through Connect Sync, and manage our domain controllers better. Yes, we have conditional access-based access control towards Entra ID. So yes, I can have device filters still. I can still do pause. I can still all do that kind of stuff. There's Entra ID protection on by default. I can use Defender for Identity, group write-back. I have SCIM provisioning, SQL provisioning. It's all there. And I can have Entra ID password protection. And through group write-back, I can manage most aspects, I believe, of Active Directory through Entra ID. But of course, if you have a different opinion, then after the session, please come up. So I'll skip that one, and I'll give you this one, because this is just a two-day event. But if you have questions or remarks or anything like that after the event, this is the information that you can use to contact me. And with that, that one? Nope, yep, that one. I'd like to say thank you and enjoy the rest of the HIP conference.